Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by HarperCollins Australia. Listeners, no matter how many authors I interview on this podcast, I'm still gobsmacked when I find another talented Aussie author whom I've not encountered before or whose work I've not had the pleasure of reading. And so when I heard about Joanne Fedler's new book published by HarperCollins Australia recently, I knew I had to learn more about her. Originally from South Africa, Joanne Fedler is an international best-selling author of 15 books, a writing mentor, women's rights activist, and keen ocean swimmer. Her books have sold over 750,000 copies worldwide. And Joanne is joining me on the podcast today to talk about her latest novel, The Whale's Last Song. Welcome to the podcast, Joanne.
Thank you so much for having me, Claudine. I'm so thrilled to be with you today.
It's my pleasure. Now, Joanne, in preparation for our chat today, and I think as an important prelude to chatting about your novel, I was looking at your website and intrigued to learn that you're an ocean swimmer, as I mentioned previously, and that this is one of the ways that you describe yourself. It doesn't read as a hobby as such, but a part of who you are. And you even dedicate a part of your website to a description of yourself as an ocean swimmer. So if you could tell me a little bit more about this and why it's an important part of who you are today.
That's a lovely question to kick off with, Claudine. You know, I am late to swimming. I did swim as a child. We all had to do swimming lessons, but I only started swimming in the ocean 6 years ago, and it happened through a series of unfortunate events that happened to me. I very badly slipped a disc in my back and was bed-stricken for about 8 weeks overseas. I couldn't get back. And when I finally got back to Australia, I had to start moving again. And because I live close to the beach, I started walking and found a little ocean pool and started swimming in this ocean pool. And while I was doing that, I started seeing people swimming across the bay where I live. And this sort of desire, I can only explain it as a desire in me just flared, and I wondered, could I ever do something like that? It looked so enticing. And so I did my research and I spoke to lifeguards, and I slowly started to enter into the ocean. I'm quite scared of the ocean. I never really learned how to, swim through waves, and I began to swim. And I even, a couple of years ago, did an Aussie certification to become a swimming coach, because I really feel like swimming in the ocean has fundamentally changed the person that I am. It has eroded my boundaries of my sense of myself. When you're swimming out in the ocean water, you have such a sense of yourself as irrelevant, in the sense that you encounter creatures that can really hurt you, that are much bigger than you. You are a visitor there. It also pushed me beyond my boundaries of fear, which has always been a really big part of my internal experience. I've always dealt with fear. I've always felt afraid of things. And so swimming in the ocean fundamentally shifted aspects of myself. It also took me into a great love and appreciation of the ocean and ocean creatures, and I've done a lot of research into, obviously, every creature that I come across. I will come straight home and I will research them and find out interesting things about them. And I feel like the ocean, which just lives outside my door, is almost like this world, this enchanted world that we know so little about. And whales are probably one of the most fascinating and intriguing creatures that we also know very little about. So it was all of these things that sort of provided, I suppose, the climate or the environment in which The Whale's Last Song became just such a cry from deep, deep, deep inside of me.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. And Joanne, mentoring writers is another important part of who you are. And I see this in the inspirational quotes and nuggets of wisdom which are peppered throughout your website pages, one of which I'd love to quote for listeners, if I may. And it's where you say, quote, "I believe we are not here on this earth for ourselves. We are here as ourselves. but we are here for each other. Every day offers us the chance to live into that prayer, unquote. Now that I've read the Whale's Last Song, that phrase carries a great deal of resonance for me in terms of understanding you as a writer. So I wondered if you could tell me a bit more about your philosophy and how it fed into your inspiration for the Whale's Last Song.
Another lovely question, Claudine. I suppose in the last 10 years, as my children have grown up and my sense of myself as a mother, the roles of myself as a mother have started to shift, and I've headed into midlife, and I lost my mother, so my sense of myself as a daughter has changed. I've started to have a much more fluid sense of myself and a sense of who it is possible for me to be. And I've always worked in areas where you have a certain freedom, if you have a certain ability in this world, that apart from using that for one's own self-aggrandizement or success, however one wants to use that, is that the greatest thing that we can do is to use that as a way of helping other people. You know, there is so much philosophy around that. Toni Morrison, the wonderful writer, said, you know, that when you have freedom, that is something that you need to give and gift to other people. And I think growing up in South Africa was obviously, a huge part of that for me, understanding that everything that I had, all the privileges I had were random. They were just these random things. And I also grew up with a sister who is deaf. And so from the very earliest age, I understood too that just simply being able to hear was a gift that I had. Other people didn't have that. And it didn't make me better or superior to somebody, but it was a tool, therefore, that I could use. And that is why I suppose, for me, the essence of my mentoring and the essence of my life has always been about helping other people to find their voice. When my sister was young, she's older than me, but when she was little, she couldn't speak until she'd had speech and hearing therapy. And I could speak very early, and somehow obviously intuited very early on that she couldn't speak, I could speak. I had to be a bridge for her and help her. It's a wonderful way to live in the world, because you constantly are not comparing yourself to people who have more than you, but looking for ways in which you have more than others. And it just gives you so many opportunities to open a door, offer something, be generous, and it's within all our power. We always have more than somebody else, no matter where we are, on any spectrum. We have the opportunity to be useful. And I feel like a lot of the self-help around focusing so much on the self has actually made us more lonely, more depressed, more disconnected. Because when you are living a life that is about supporting other people, you always feel like you belong, you have a purpose, you've got something, you're meant to be here. It's when you're focusing on yourself and you become dissatisfied and you're not doing you're not getting where you want to get to. I think that causes so much a sense of I'm not worthy, I'm a failure. So for me, everything that I've been given, I consider to be luck. I consider to be gifts. What do you do with those? Well, those are to be passed on. Nothing that you keep for yourself do you keep. The only things that you keep are the ways in which you pass the things you have on. I think it is definitely fundamental to my philosophy as a person, and that's why I love what swimming has done for me, because I think the cult of celebrity, the cult of the guru in this culture we grow up in, the cult of all of that has actually really damaged our sense of community, our sense of who belongs to our family, who we put our arms around. And when you sort of let go of the ego and you just open your heart, everybody has a place there. Every creature has a place there, So it's been one of the greatest joys of my life to mentor people and get them to publication and be part of that journey. I often have greater joy in seeing the success of others than even my own, because my own is sort of so kind of contaminated and polluted with all my ego disabilities and all my sort of wants and desires, but not when it comes to other people. When it comes to other people, my heart can just be full and joyous. Mentoring is a huge part of what gives my life great meaning and joy.
I love that so much, Joanne. And that's something that so many of us can learn from, particularly those of us on a writing journey. Such wise words indeed. And I think this is, a really great space or really great spot in our chat for you to perhaps tell us a little bit more about The Whale's Last Song, particularly for those who haven't yet read it.
So this book came as such a surprise, really, Claudine. I've had such a long writing career. I started writing like 20 years ago, and I had my first book published in 2005. And it seemed in those very early years that I was set on this trajectory for great, success as a writer, because one of my books, my second book, sold 500,000 copies in Germany. It was in 2006 and 7, it was on the bestseller list. And I thought, oh, well, here we go. This is how it's going to be. And ever since then, my career has had this sort of like this downward slide. I got very caught up in this idea that I just hadn't quite made it because I peaked too early and then I couldn't replicate that success. And that's part of the reason why I went into mentoring other people and looking for other ways in which that, I could make a living as a writer. In fact, a couple of years ago, it struck me that I needed to give up writing. I couldn't see what the purpose was. I was really worried about climate change. I was doing all kinds of courses on enlivenment and understanding what was actually happening to our world. And it felt to me maybe writing was, I don't know, maybe, I was fiddling while Rome was burning, and I needed to do something about the climate for the children. So I announced on my social media to everybody that I'm giving up writing and I'm going to take a job at a seaweed company, which is going to help reduce the methane in the atmosphere. And off I went to work for the seaweed company for a while. And I broke up with my writing. I had this beautiful hand-carved walking stick that I'd had above my desk, beautiful wooden artifact that I had bought when I was even before I'd become a writer. So in my 20s. And what I did with the stick was I had a divorce with my writing and I threw it into the ocean. I declared that we were done. I was finished. I'd called the stick the woman of the book because there was a beautiful woman holding a book. I think it was probably a Bible, but I'd bought it, as thinking this was the woman of the book, and I threw it into the ocean and I'd given up my writing. And then COVID came. And within COVID, my mother, who lived in South Africa, was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. And I've written a memoir about this whole experience as well of losing my mother, but it was the most transforming experience of my life, this grief, which really brought me down to my the bones of me. It really melted me down to my core. And in the grief, in the months of grief after my mother died, I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't read. I felt life felt kind of meaningless. I was really trying to work out what I was going to do in the world. By the way, the whole seaweed company thing lasted 6 weeks. It was a total disaster. I'm not really employable, I don't think. And so a friend recommended Anne Patchett's book, These Precious Days, which have these beautiful essays. I love Anne Patchett. So I sat on my bed and I read these short little essays. And one of them was about the children's author, Kate DiCamillo, whom I'd never heard of because by the time Kate had written her books, my children were already grown. And I just felt like a little girl who'd lost her mother. And I felt like I wanted to read children's books. So I bought all of Kate's books and I read them one after the other. And each one felt like a kind of like a vitamin shot to my soul. I just felt something restoring to me. And what that felt like was the love that I had for books and stories long before I had become a writer and had kind of cursed myself with this desire and need to be successful. I love writing. I love language. I love words. I love stories. And all of this came back to me reading Kate DiCamillo's books, especially this book of hers called The Magician's Elephant. And I got up and I felt that thing that I have not felt inside me for many, many, many years, which is this little stirring, this little flicker, which you learn as a writer to recognize. Oh my God, get somewhere where you can put some words on a page. And I started writing the story and all I could see was this little child running through these cobbled streets. And it was in a long time ago. And there was the pox. I knew there was the pox. And I'm sure that was because we had just come through COVID and somebody she loved was dying. I suppose because my mother was dying during the pox and she needs to try and save the sister. And that was the feeling I'd had while my mother was sick. I would have done anything to save her. And so using just that impulse, and then of course the love of the ocean. I had this whale that was dying, but that was coming back to this bay where it lived. And I knew somehow that their stories were interconnected, but I didn't know how. But I just was writing this for myself. I was thought I'm going to write a children's story for myself because maybe I can. Maybe it will be fun. And it was playful and a bit frolicsome. And I made this very evil marquee, very, very evil. And I started bringing in these little characters, and they came to me, some of them in dreams and some of them just by way of inspiration. And I wrote this little story that just felt like a balm for my own soul. I had no idea if it would be of use to anybody, whether I could write this book. Definitely, I thought it was for children. I did watercolors, I did little line drawings. It was just an experiment. Honestly, it was like a little experiment. I wanted to stay in love with language and to love this little story. And so this thing started to grow and grow and grow and grow until I had this version of it, which I thought was a children's book. And my agent, I sent it to her, and her reaction to it, I realized that it was not just for me. She loved this book so much. She was so effusive about it. When she passed it on to HarperCollins and they came back with the same thing, I realized that I had written something that was more than just for me. Maybe it was for others too. But what's interesting about this book, which I wrote for children, is I'm not a children's author. And so, whatever trajectory I've had as a writer has been for adults. I've written very serious books. When my publisher came back to me, she said she wanted me to rewrite it for an adult market, which was a complete rewrite, because I don't think I would ever have chosen to use an 11-year-old protagonist if I was writing for adults. I would have chosen an 18-year-old girl who has wild sex in the forest, maybe, or something like that. But this book is nothing like that. This book is just this pure little story of this child who is on this mission to save her sister. So it was a real task to rewrite this children's story for an adult market. But when I had finished doing this rewrite, I really felt, with all the beautiful editorial input that I had, that the book had kind of really been elevated to a place I couldn't have got to on my own, which is, of course, why it is the most incredible blessing in the world to work with brilliant editors who can sometimes see what you as the writer can't see and take you to places that you can't go on your own.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And as I said to you before we started recording, The Whale's Last Song is unlike anything I've ever read before. It's allegorical, it's magical and portentous in ways, so deep and multi-layered with meaning and rich in detail. And as I said to you, I felt a little bit unequal to the task of trying to talk to you about it.
That's crazy, Claudine. I've written it precisely for you and for people like you. I mean, that's such a sweet thing to say, but honestly, just when we love something, we don't always have to be able to say why or how or in what ways. I mean, that to me is part of the mystery of it. It's even hard for me to talk about the book because I'm really reconstructing what was something that was largely an unconscious process. I'm trying to explain to you how I came to write it and whatever, and I'm sure that there are lots of things I've left out, and I don't even know the sort of the multi-layered ways in which the book came through me, which is kind of really how it felt, because it felt a lot like a dream that I just kind of had and sort of woke from. I didn't want it to finish because it really, while I was writing it, I felt like I was inside this world that had been given to me. And I think the ocean swimming and grief was also like one of the layers in it. The author Sharon Blackie says the most amazing thing about grief. She says, grief is an element of enchantment. And I always found that such a fascinating statement. But in writing this book, I kind of got the sense of what she means by that, because grief takes us into these very mysterious places and into little hallways and corridors and doors that we can't conceive of until grief has swallowed us, and there is this kind of way in which we survive grief, and it's mysterious. There isn't like 5 steps towards how you get through grief, but I know for certain that writing The Whale's Last Song was was one of those ways that helped me process my grief. And it was kind of an enchanted way. I couldn't have predicted it. I couldn't have foreseen it or foretold it or imagined it even until it occurred the way that it did.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you. That's a really wonderful way of describing what oftentimes is a magical process of writing a novel. Now, let's talk about Tio, who's the central character in this book, and she's connected to everything in ways she is yet to understand. And part of her journey is about uncovering her own story. So, is identity and belonging something that you consciously wanted to explore in this novel?
You know, I wish I had more sensible things to say about like the themes, because I've even been asked now to come up with some like book club questions for the book. And I'm thinking to myself, I wouldn't even begin to know what kind of book club questions to ask, but that's a really good book club question, I think. Thank you. I suppose it probably must be, if that feels like, something that was thematic, but I think, of course, for all of us, I think after my mother died, what was really interesting to me was learning who she was as a person outside of the role that she had being my mother. I found some of her old diaries in the back of her cupboard. I didn't know my mother even kept diaries. She was very different to me. She was a doctor. She was quite emotionally distant. You would even say possibly she was a little bit cold. But in these journals, I really saw a side to her that I didn't know of. And it felt to me that after she died, it's just the strange paradox of it, is that I actually felt like I became closer to her and learned more about her, because I felt like when she was my mother, she had this role, and that was almost like an obstacle towards me really seeing her as a woman, what she was like as a child, as a teenager, all the roles that she had before she became my mother. And for me, I think that the book definitely deals with our identities in relation to mothers, mothering. Who is your mother? Where is your mother when your mother is gone? I think these were all big questions that were sitting inside of me in these kind of unarticulated ways. And what is so beautiful about writing is it is a bit like the dream state, where it throws up these analogies or these images that are analogies, I suppose, for one's emotional state. They sort of reveal your emotional state to you more than the other way around. It's not like you feel like you have this emotional state and then you ask for like a projection of some sort of image that you can then use. It's almost like in a dream, you dream something and then you try to work out, well, what is that telling me about my emotional state? And I suppose for me in the writing, that's what Tia was, a kind of a projection of a little character. And from her, I suppose I can go back and say, well, this is probably where I was emotionally when I started conceiving her, because yeah, I feel like often a character is something that your psyche throws out for you, and you have to work your way backwards to an understanding of really perhaps what gave rise to that, what was the context, where did that come from? A character is like an emergent factor in this beautiful submergent sea of consciousness. It's all the submergence that gives rise to that emergent factor. So really the place we want to kind of look at is, what are we feeding that submergent place? Because that is what's going to produce the things that we want to write about. So definitely identity, sacrifice, what people are prepared to do for one another, mistakes, making mistakes, but out of love, like thinking this is the right thing to do. I'm going to do this thing to sacrifice myself, or do this thing because I want to try and protect somebody. I mean, this is something that we as parents do all the time. We think we're protecting our children. We sacrifice, we do things for them. And invariably, it turns out to be a kind of a misconception of what is really needed. But I suppose what I really wanted to do in this book was to show that even if we make mistakes in life, why we've done something is what matters, not the result of it. Like a mistake that has come from a place of love is not a mistake. We're all error-ridden. We're all filled with these failures and these broken bits, because all my characters, I wanted to, they were all broken. I wanted to make them all very broken and in all these places, but also to show how beautiful people are in their brokenness. Everybody's brokenness has its place in the story as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, sacrifice was going to be my next book club question. It's definitely a theme that is coming through very strongly in this story, and something that you explore with such tenderness and beauty, I think, in this book. But talking about broken people, now I don't know if I can say his name very well, but it's Graviel Torero.
Graviel. Graviel
Graviel Torero.
Ferrero. Yeah.
Now, he was such an intriguing character, a very damaged man and consigned to do the dirty work of the Marquis. But as a new father, he undergoes a sort of radical transformation in ways, doesn't he?
Funnily enough, he became, and this was also what it was a surprise because he sort of began as a sort of a little small character, but then as I wrote the story, he grew and grew and grew, and I loved him more and more and more, gave him more and more space, and so he then became almost my favorite character. And I think most people who've read the book say that he is their favorite character. I do feel a lot of love towards him because, he's dyslexic and he's been told he's stupid and he believes these things, and yet there is this other little part of him that has become alive through the birth of his daughter that his wife gently fans and restores. And it's just that deep internal instinct outside of all the names we've ever been called, outside of all the ways in which we have been broken by life. It starts to learn to trust himself and to trust what he knows about himself, which he's never had the chance to before. And I think that's just true for so many of us in life. We're sort of so bombarded by who we're supposed to be and what we should do and how we should become. And it's just finding that small inner voice inside of us that can kind of cut through the noise, that kind of internal quiet place inside of ourselves where we know who we are. And sometimes, it takes a catastrophe for that to happen to us. And yeah, I honestly, when I started writing this book, he was not even somebody that was on my radar. I just saw him as this character, this enormous man with this very big head, wearing a helmet that was too tight. And he was almost like a comic figure. He was wearing a helmet that was too tight and squashing his ears, almost like, as an image of how our roles and the ways in which our work and our jobs and the things we're told we have to do confine us, even wearing a tie or like stockings and high heels and all those things that we in our modern lives do can really squash the life out of us. And so, part of the story is about how he transforms, and I think he possibly does have the biggest character arc of the story. So yeah, I do love Graviel. And it's so interesting, Claudine, because so many male friends of mine have reached out to me after reading this book and have said that the male figures have been treated with such tenderness. Even the evil Marquis, who is very evil. I based him on Joseph Goebbels. I did a lot of research on Joseph Goebbels, who was Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, just to try and understand him, because Joseph Goebbels himself had what they call a gammy leg. He had a leg that was, slightly crippled from, I think, polio or some childhood illness. And yet, he was part of the propaganda machine where anybody who had a disability was not worthy. Fascinated by that as a human characteristic of that level of, I don't know whether it was self-hatred, self-denial, and also the ability to use language in propaganda so that you can talk people out of noticing that you yourself are the very thing that that you have have propaganda against. It was just, to me, so interesting. But I do see him as a tender character because of the whole historical context in which this story is taking place is during the witch trials. And I guess for me as well, part of what I wanted people to see was the link between the violence that happens in society and the ways in which that plays out in people's personal lives and the intergenerational trauma of how that all plays out. So I was really fascinated when I started to research medieval Spain and the plague of Seville, which is sort of round about the time when the story is set. And it suddenly occurred to me that there would have been an overlap with the witch trials, and indeed there was. So, those are lovely things when you're researching and you see that, oh, in fact, that does make a lot of sense. And then I understood that that's where his story would fit in, that his mother was, I suppose we shouldn't give it all away, but anyway, his story is tied up with the witch, with the whole witch trials of that time.
Yeah, indeed. So fascinating. And yeah, talking about the setting of your book set in medieval times, the novel is timeless in many ways. And I think part of the reason that it feels that way is because of your use of the second person narrative, which is not super common to find across novels these days. So I wondered if you could give me some insight into why you use this point of view.
Did I use that point of view?
I think so. Oh God.
Okay. All right. So you mean
Tell me if you think I'm wrong, because
no. I have been asked a lot of questions about the voice, the narrative voice. So yes, there is definitely this very unusual narrative voice that honestly, when I sat down to write the first few chapters, that voice was just there. And the only other time I've ever had that experience was with a book I wrote which came out in 2008 called Things Without a Name, where I literally sat down and I could hear that voice and it just flowed out of me. This was the same experience. And it was definitely a voice that was overarching, overlooking, and could see the way this was going to play out, and was saying to the reader, don't you worry, that's going to be resolved, that you're going to have to be patient, that we're not there yet. And when people have asked me about this voice, I'm not sure where it came from, and I don't know what it was doing. But if I'm being asked to try and understand myself, is that I was writing for this little girl inside of me who'd just lost her mother. And perhaps, inside of each of us, there is this part of ourselves that can step away from the emotion that we're caught up in. It's this ability to self-soothe, this mothering that stays within us even after we no longer have a mother. And perhaps it's just that sort of that soothing voice saying, you're going to be okay. This story is playing itself out in the way that it is. And it's quite stern at times, that voice. It's quite instructive. But again, I'm not sure really where it comes from. I wish I could have a cleverer answer for you, but I think that's the best that I can do.
Well, I mean, look, some authors are really clear about why they structure it. And I'm always fascinated by that, because for me, writing is often very intuitive, and a story comes to you the way it comes to you, and you don't necessarily understand the reasons why. And I'm always fascinated when somebody can tell me that they use a technique for a very specific reason. And I just never feel that I'm clever enough, I guess.
I think some of us, are much more forensic about this sort of thing. And when I teach writing and I teach structure, it's quite hard for me to explain why I do things. And the person that's given me the most insight into this process, and I don't think it's about being clever, I think it's just the way mine and your brains probably work, is George Saunders. He's got a lovely book and also a Substack where he talks about storytelling, and he's quite clever with explaining how things are done. But he talks about how so many of our decisions as writers are intuitive, and we hone that intuition by working into the sentence until, he says, it becomes undeniable. Now, that's very hard to teach to somebody, because you've really got to have a kind of a real intimacy with the story you're telling, and with the language that you're working with, and where you're going with it. And I think that the best one can do is to just spend a lot of time working with a sentence and reading it aloud and hearing it and understanding, and then going from one sentence to two sentences to a paragraph and seeing, does that feel undeniable? And I often, when I go through stuff, and I have to be in the right frame of mind, I can hear when something is not quite working yet. And it's quite hard for me to explain to somebody why it doesn't quite work yet. And then I'm shuffling words around until it sort of like clicks, like an Apple product, in a box. And, okay, that feels undeniable to me. But, I think some people have more of that meta perspective about writing, that they work more to, I won't say a formula, but they work more to a kind of an invisible structure that to them is visible before things begin. For me, I am such an intuitive person. I just dive in and I play around, and at about 35,000 words, I think, okay, enough. Step back and start, structuring this thing and make some intelligent decisions about it. And that's when, as you'll see, but you can probably see behind me, I'm working on another book now, and I start with post-it notes and I start moving things around. But I think some people begin like that. They structure their thinking, they structure their story. And I've read lots of books on that kind of thing. I'm not that kind of writer. And for me, it takes something away from the organic, mysterious. I don't like things to be explained too much to me. To me, it's a bit like explaining why a joke is funny. I think that's good for a course on understanding humor. But if you explain to me why something is funny, I feel as if it's not that funny anymore because the understanding is a different part of my brain, and I just want to like laugh, and maybe I don't want to understand why it's funny or why it's moving, but when you're a writer and you are trying to sort of elicit a certain emotional response, and I do teach this, we are structuring emotions. So sometimes when people are working with like suspense or drama or humor, we have to work out, how things work, especially for people for whom this is not intuitive. And I think for a lot of people it isn't. And when it's not intuitive, you have to maybe learn like the little building blocks of things. And I think this is partly where in my mentoring, people get a bit frustrated because they want me to explain to them how. And I just want to say to them, just go into the writing, stay in the writing, be inside the writing, trust yourself, make lots of decisions, and then we'll come out and we will, see what you've done. But people often want to know, well, when do I do this and how do I do that? And there are lots of people who can teach that very, very, very well. For me, the way when I teach writing, I focus much more on what I call your consciousness, and that is more who you are as a person. I like to focus on things like your curiosity, your courage, your connection to the story, your conscientiousness, which is really just about a lot of time in, sitting with your writing, a lot of time. People think that there is a kind of like a way of getting there quickly. There isn't a way of getting there quickly, and I can't show you a shortcut. I don't think it works. And so I focus on these elements of consciousness because I believe that if we are curious, we won't ever slip into cliche. If we have courage, we will make emotionally risky decisions in the writing. If we are conscientious, we will work a piece of writing until it becomes undeniable, all of those things. And the main thing I think that people work up against inside their consciousness is conviction. Most writers that I work with have this self-doubt, don't trust themselves, keep coming up against it. And for me, when I mentor, this is the thing that I try to nurture in people, is the ability to trust themselves, not to keep looking to me for an answer, because I keep saying, I don't know what the right way is for you to structure the story. I can't give you the right way to do it, but this story knows how it wants to be told, and you are the person that it's coming through. And so what always strikes me, Claudine, is how little people trust themselves. And it's also got to do with believing that you have something worth saying. It comes back down to voice. And because I work with women, I see it over and over and over and over again. And so a lot of the mentoring that I do is to keep reminding people that what they have is worth saying, that their writing is worth putting out in the world, that they can do it. Because I think a lot of us lose our connection to it when we get filled with that form of self-doubt, which comes from, everything. It comes from so far back. It comes from all the messages we get around us in society. And yeah, so getting people to believe in themselves is almost like, do you remember that beautiful book called The Help? I think it's by Catherine Stockett or something like that. There was an amazing character in it, the nanny, and she would say to the little girl, you is kind, you is smart, you is important. She would just keep putting those words back into the little girl, like, as if it was like, finally, if she could say it enough times, the little girl would believe it, because she had a mother who was so incredibly, neurotic and, critical. And I sometimes feel like as a mentor, I'm simply reminding people what you have to say is important. You can do this, and sometimes you really just need somebody, a mothering presence that just reminds you, you've got this, you can do it.
That's brilliant. Fantastic. Yes, Aibileen was one of my most favorite characters.
Exactly. That's it. I loved her so much.
She was indeed a beautiful character. And I was going to ask you about tips for unpublished writers out there, or indeed any other aspiring author or, established author who listens to this podcast. But I think you've given us some really wonderful pearls of wisdom there. So, Joanne, I wondered if there was one thing that you would like readers to take away from this novel, what would that be?
I think to have a friendship with your creativity is the most important part of the writing process, and to do it from a place of love and not to put a curse on your writing and insist that it does anything out in the world. Like, if something is important to you, that is enough of a reason for you to give it your full, unadulterated love and attention. You know, you might write something that completely surprises you the way that this book did for me. The one last thing I will say, because I think this book is about love, in not romantic love, but love. In some ways it is about romantic love, but it's about all kinds of love. But the story I'll leave you with, Claudine, is that, as I told you, my mum was not one to be too emotional or use too many words, but when she was dying, and she knew she was dying. She was a doctor, so she knew exactly what was going on. And just probably weeks before she died, she said to my dad, "I love my life." And she had a very little life. You know, my mother, she loved her TV, she loved cooking, she loved her garden, she loved her cat, she loved watching reruns of Judge Judy. My mother was not she didn't have a big life. It was really the most modest little life you can imagine. But she said to my dad, "I love my life." And what she was saying to him is, I don't want to die. And then when she died and we found these diaries of hers in the back of her cupboard, I looked through the diaries and I found those 4 words in different places: I and love and my and life. And I got a tattoo artist in my mother's handwriting to actually create a little tattoo for me that says "I love my life," which I've had tattooed on my left forearm. Again, this is something I'm reconstructing because Teo, loves life. She loves every creature on the planet. She loves everything in her life. She loves her own body. She's only got one eye, but she loves it. There's no reason for her not to love it. And it felt to me like that statement, "I love my life," and the life that I have is tiny little silver thread maybe that runs through the story. And I hope that when people finish reading the book, that their heart feels lifted, that they can feel some love for their life, for the life that we have on this planet, for the creatures that we share this planet with. It's a story that I hope will make people feel that they belong to this world and that the world belongs to them. We're here for such a short time. And the story really, I really wanted people to have a sense of just like the story will go on and life goes on with or without us. The Mary Oliver quote at the beginning for me also holds it, which is, "Perhaps the world without us is the real poem." And if we can live our lives knowing that the world existed before us, the world goes on after us. So we're here for like a blink. And what do we want to do in that blink? And really, the best that we can do is just to love each other and the world. And that's what I hope people feel when they finish reading the book.
Oh, that's beautiful. On that wonderful, poignant note, Joanne, I'd like to say it's been such a joy getting to know you a little bit better and to chat with you about your beautiful book, The Whale's Last Song. Thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thank you for having me, Claudine. It was such fun.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.